welcome to a setup that you will never see again, because trying to get the lighting to work in this space was not easy. However, I think I've managed it. I think we're in the clear. I think you've got a picture of what's going on behind me. And from the title of the video, you will have already guessed. Anyway, this video is my classical literature bookcase collection tour, whatever you want to call it. If you don't know me, if you've not been around for long and this is the first video you're watching, then a little bit of background is that I am an ancient historian, a classicist, what have you. I am in the final stages of completing my PhD at the moment, and I have been studying and researching in the field of classics or ancient history since 2010, so it's been quite a few years now. I have made some videos in the past on classical literature. I have a podcast, if you're interested, called That's Ancient History, which is all about antiquity, Greece, Rome, and hopefully many others in the future. But this is basically my passion subject. This is a topic that is so close to my heart, that has brought me so much joy, and that I essentially spend a lot of my time researching. Because of that, I have amassed quite a collection of a classical literature over here. So when I say classical literature, what I'm referring to, generally speaking, is the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which is often known as the classical world, classical civilizations, what have you. Again, this is something that is sort of changing over time, that is up for debate, because often ancient history, again, focuses on ancient Greece and ancient Rome, despite them not being the only cultures that existed back then. But my expertise in particular lie within the study of ancient Greece, democratic Athens to be specific. So because of that, my ancient literature collection is predominantly what you might call classical in terms of Greek and Roman. I think there's a couple of pieces of literature on here that aren't Greek or Roman, but because my studies and degrees have always focused on Greece and Rome, that's what I have predominantly. Some of these books I bought for courses I studied, some I've bought of my own accord, out of my own interest, and others are actually my dad's. So again, if you don't know me and this is the first video you're watching of me, my dad passed away about 2.5 years ago, but he himself was like a massive history buff. He loved studying history of all periods, and he had his own sort of collection of classical literature. And because of that, I have sort of put them all together on this bookcase, which is in my mum's house, and it includes all of my classical literature and all of his classical literature. And the reason I want to mention that specifically is because there are a few doubles on this shelf. There are a few works of classical literature that I have more than one copy of, and there's usually two reasons for that. One of those is that one copy is my dad's and one copy is mine, and I don't want to get rid of either copy. And the other reason might be that I specifically wanted multiple translations of that work. Now that's more common when it comes to Greek literature for me, but translations can vary greatly, and then there's different introductions from different scholars and different editions. So there's reasons potentially for me owning more than one edition, and I'll probably talk more about that as we get into the books. But I think this video might end up being a bit of like a long rambly one, because like I said, this is my passion topic. I have a lot to say on it, and I know that I've been asked quite a few times for an in-depth tour of my classical literature collection, so I don't want to skim over anything. But this is what it looks like. I've managed to squeeze it all on one shelf. There's a couple of little gaps, I have to say. We've got a couple little gaps, and I was thinking when I was putting everything on this bookshelf what I would want to fill these gaps with. I think I own the majority of Greek literature that's easily accessible in current publishing and in English translations, but there's a couple of pieces of Roman literature that I might look into getting in the future, like Juvenal and Horace, who were comedic writers from the Roman period, and I don't own either of them, so that might be something I would look into getting. And we'll just see as I amass more, because there is possible, you know, futures in which I end up wanting different translations of things, or more specifically editions of things in ancient Greek. I don't really know much Latin at all. I've spent very little time studying Latin, but I have spent a lot of time studying ancient Greek, so some of the editions I have of these books contain the texts in ancient Greek. So again, I will get into it all and share it with you now. I guess I'll quickly just like adjust the camera to show you that there's a third shelf down here which predominantly contains hardbacks and a lot of my dad's sort of older editions of things. Then as you can see, I've sort of put all my Oxford World Classics together and then all of my Penguin Classics together. Yes, okay, I could have like organised this so many different ways. I could have organised it chronologically, I could have organised it by Greek and Roman, I could have organised it by genre, I could have organised it alphabetically, which I have done slightly, but I think I have quite a visual memory, so I find it really easy to remember a copy of a book that I might want to read based on the cover, so separating things into editions is easier for me to find it, and I also just think it looks quite nice, and you know what, that is something I consider when organising my bookcases, and I don't care. So let's start up at the top. I'll bring down the copies of classical literature from up here, who sit next to my little Socrates statue that my dad brought me back from Athens many years ago. So if you haven't come across these before, perhaps because you haven't studied classics in the past, these are the Loeb or Loeb editions. They're published by Harvard University Press, and they are some of the sort of most common ancient language editions you'll find of books, which also contain very like straightforward translations of the texts. So nothing particularly flowery or interpretive, although I don't think that's entirely possible to have a non-interpretive translation, but they try to be quite straightforward. The green editions are all Greek literature, and the red editions are all Roman literature, so in Latin. Now, the only reason I own a Latin one, given that I've just told you I don't really read or speak or understand Latin, is because I wanted this book and it was the sort of easiest accessible translation of it, because sometimes some ancient literature isn't as easy to get your hands on because it's not published as widely, because it's not read as widely, whereas like Homer's Odyssey is constantly being translated and new editions are constantly coming out of it. Something like this, which is Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica, a retelling of the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece and the Princess Medea, is not. And therefore I ended up with this edition, which also has the Latin in it, but to be perfectly honest, there's no way in high heaven that I'm ever going to be reading the Latin. I have it so I can read the English, and that's what that book is. I then have a slightly more impressive collection of ancient Greek copies of Loeb's. So some of the ones that are the most well loved here include this edition of Chariton's Kalirahoi. This is another one that actually isn't that easily accessible in other editions, and I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on the ancient Greek novel, which is a collection of 5 pieces of ancient Greek literature that were written in prose, and this is one of those. They're all sort of romance novels, and I ended up reading them all, although I didn't focus my entire dissertation on all of them, but because of that I wanted editions of all of them originally, that's why I bought them. And this one is quite beat up because I've read it quite often, and I've read it since then in terms of my research into like the treatment of women and violence towards women, which is what I specialise in now. So that's my little edition of Chariton's Kalirahoi. I also, in a similar vein, if I look through these, have this, which is Longus's Daphnis and Chloe and Xenophon of Ephesus Anthea and Habracombe. So this is 2 in 1 because it's one of the only editions of Xenophon of Ephesus that you can get, mainly because, to be honest, it isn't the best piece of ancient literature. I wouldn't particularly recommend it for recreational reading, but I wanted that, which was one of the other ancient Greek novels, along with Daphnis and Chloe, which I own in other editions. So I own a little Loeb of that. Some of these have little tabs in them. One that has a lot of tabs in it here is this edition of Aeschylus. So Aeschylus was an ancient Greek playwright, and I've really gone to town on the tabbing of this. It is in particular in 2 plays, Prometheus Bound and The Suppliants. Now I can tell you now the reason that I went to town on the Prometheus Bound play is because it contains a lot of insect similes, and that's something I have also spent time researching. Yes, I know, very random. But Aeschylus, like I said, ancient Greek playwright. This contains Persians, Seven Against Thebes, Suppliants, Prometheus Bound. I also have another edition of Aeschylus. This is Aeschylus' Oresteia with the Agamemnon, Libation Bearers and the Eumenides, which is the only complete trilogy of ancient Greek plays we have. Ancient Greek plays were always performed in trilogies, but this is the only one where we have the text of all 3 plays surviving, and I'm pretty certain that my dad actually bought me this as a Christmas present one year. I then have one of my favourite pieces of ancient Greek literature, which is Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, another one like Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica that retells the myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece, although this one's a lot more famous and well known, and I have other editions of it as well. I have also done research into that, which is why I own multiple editions. Then lastly, we have The Fall of Troy by Quintus Smyrnius, which is one that I bought again because this was the only really easily accessible translation of the epic, which is the sort of follow-up to the events of the Iliad. It's written by a different author than Homer, who wrote the Iliad, but it is the events following the Iliad in which we see like the Trojan horse, for example. So those are my Loebs, and then we come on to my lovely Oxford World Classics. Now, one of the things that I get asked a lot is what translation of a work should I buy, and I always find, if I haven't had a specific translation recommended to me, which happens occasionally, and I'll mention some good translations here, that Oxford World Classic is a safe bet. If you don't know what to get an Oxford World Classic, because you're always guaranteed to get a relatively like accurate, up-to-date translation in their editions, and that's kind of what I learned from my university experience. Maybe some people disagree with me, but that's kind of my go-to for translations. And I did sort of go in alphabetical order. So we start with the A's. I'll bring all the A's off, and I've mixed together Greek and Roman. But if we go in alphabetical order, we have Achilles, Tatius, Leucippe, and Cleitophon, which is another one of the ancient Greek novels that I mentioned. We have Aesop's Fables, which are a collection of fables written by an ancient Greek slave. The Library of Greek Mythology by Apollodorus, which is such an excellent go-to if you're trying to get into Greek mythology, because it is basically just a collection of loads of different Greek myths in one place, collected together by an author who's actually known as Pseudo-Apollodorus, because we don't know their real identity. We then have, and I didn't notice this until I was organising these bookcases, literally two of the exact same editions of Jason and the Golden Fleece. I think earlier I mentioned that my undergraduate dissertation was on the ancient Greek novel. It was also on Jason and the Golden Fleece. So I have two copies of this, both of which I have tabbed and written in, and for that reason don't want to get rid of either, because I don't know, I might have written something profound in one of these editions, and I wouldn't want to lose those profound notes that I made, and I do think it's a little bit mad that I do have two, but there we go. I've written in them both, so I'm keeping them both basically. We then have two works of Aristophanes. So Aristophanes was a comedic playwright, and we have this edition which contains frogs, women at the Thesmophori, if I'm not mistaken, and clouds. And then we have Aristophanes' Birds and Other Plays, which contains Lysistrata, the Assemblywomen, Wealth, and Birds. Again, you can see that I have tabbed these up slightly. I have no qualms about writing in and putting stickers in my ancient literature. We then have The Art of Rhetoric by Aristotle, who was an ancient Greek philosopher, and this is on The Art of Rhetoric. Rhetoric and violence against women are actually my current areas of research for my PhD. We then have 1C, which is my first piece of Latin literature for that bookshelf, and it is the complete poems of Catullus. Our singular D, which is Demosthenes, and this is a collection of selected speeches by Demosthenes. He was an ancient Greek orator who wrote court speeches in particular for those finding themselves in the Athenian courtroom, as well as himself, and this is just like a selection of those speeches. We then have some E's. We have Euripides, Medea, and Other Plays. This collection contains Medea, Hippolytus, Electra, and Helen, as well as Eratosthenes and Hyginus' constellation myths, and this is two authors, Eratosthenes and Hyginus, collected in one volume, and they both again sort of collected lots of myths together, specifically in regards to the myths that explain the origin of certain constellations. We then have Hesiod and Homer. I'm not gonna lie, I've got quite a few editions of the Odyssey, as you will see as we carry on. This is quite a recent translation by Anthony Verity in this lovely Oxford World Classics edition. We then have Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, which are two didactic poems by the poet Hesiod about the origin of humanity and the gods and the way that the universe is structured. We then have another copy of that good old book I mentioned earlier called Daphnis and Chloe by Longus, which was one of the ones that I focused my undergraduate dissertation on, and I have a story around this because this is a very new, pristine, beautiful copy that I actually only bought last year. I had a beautiful, beat up, tabbed to high heavens, highlighted, written on edition, and that's the way I like them, and it had all my notes and my thoughts in it on something that is one of my favourite pieces of ancient Greek literature. I recommend this all the time if you want somewhere to start with ancient Greek literature. This is the book you should read. However, I was dating somebody a few years ago now who put my copy in the bin after we broke up. So my lovely, written in, beautiful, beat up edition that had come through all my years of university with me and meant quite a lot to me was binned, and I never got it back, so I had to replace it. And there's a little piece of wisdom for you: don't date anyone that would put a book in the bin. We then have Lucan's Civil War, which is a text all about the Roman Civil War by a Roman writer. This was my dad's. This is not something I necessarily would have gone out to pick up myself, because I consider myself a Greek historian, not a Roman one. We then have the Plays and Fragments of Menander, which are comedic plays by a later Greek writer. The P's, which include Plautus's 4 comedies, and these are Roman comedies, and I do actually really enjoy Latin literature. I just don't tend to pick up things like this of my own accord because it's more Roman history, whereas like I quite like reading Latin literature. However, I have also had experience teaching undergrads sort of ancient history from early Greece to late Rome, so let's not lie, this stuff comes in incredibly handy, and I do like to retain some familiarity with it. But because a lot of ancient Greek and Roman literature is accessible online, I wouldn't necessarily buy things I am going to read in full or look at regularly. And if you are looking to read some ancient Greek literature online, you can actually access translations of virtually anything on the Perseus Tufts website, which I'll link down below. Although note that they are not always the most up-to-date translations, so they can read a little bit stiltedly. We then have some speeches by the Greek philosopher Plato, the defense of Socrates, Euthyphro and Crito. We have Pindar's Complete Odes. This is another one that is an excellent beginner's book for Greek mythology because it collects loads and loads of Greek myths together. And then my favourite piece of ancient Latin literature, which is Petronius's Satyricon, and this is a comedic novel written by a Latin writer, and it's hilarious. However, the film adaptation by the Italian director Fellini traumatized me forever, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but the book, yes. We then have 2 works by the ancient Roman poet Ovid. The Fasti, which is the mythological origins of all the different months in the Roman calendar, and the Metamorphosis, which is a huge, long, epic Latin poem which explores so many myths relating to metamorphosis, aka when something turns into something else. We then have the S's. So we have Seneca's 6 Tragedies. Seneca was a Roman tragedian. And Sallust's Catiline's Conspiracy, the Jugurinthine War and History. So these are works of Roman history related by Sallust, another one that was my dad's. I'll just probably mention if it was my dad's, everything else will be mine. Then we've got Theocritus's Idylls, which are ancient Greek poems. Really love this collection. It's more bucolic and less like epic and dramatic, and I really like that. It's sort of a different period in ancient Greek literature. We then, I'm just going to take all of these down, have Virgil's Aeneid, which is my copy of the ancient Roman epic poem of the hero Aeneas, and I do not particularly like this book. I studied it during my undergrad, and honestly I didn't really enjoy it, but I know that's controversial. We then have one of the few non-ancient Greek or Roman works on my bookcase, which is the Tales of Sinemé and Other Ancient Egyptian Poems from 1940 to 1640 BC, so like 4,000 years ago. And then a collection of Greek lyric poetry edited and translated by M.L. West. So this is lots of different authors, particularly those that we maybe only have like 1 or 2 poems for, or just fragments from, or don't even know the names of, in one place. And then my 2 older Oxford Royal Classics editions, which I just like to keep together, so includes another collection of Euripides plays. This one has within it Alcestis, Heracles, Children of Heracles and the Cyclops, as well as Ovid's love poems. So this is actually a collection of poems by Ovid called his Amores, which in different translations is translated into different titles. So the love poems is what it's usually referred to in the Oxford Royal Classics editions, but I believe I have the Penguin edition as well, in which they're referred to as his erotic poems. And then last but not least, we have 2 little books on this bookcase which are not Oxford Royal Classics, but I just ended up putting up there, which include this translation of Sappho's poetry by Mary Barnard. I love this edition. If you're looking again to read some ancient Greek literature, I would highly recommend this book and this translation. Sappho is the only ancient Greek writer that we have surviving in any substantial form who was a woman, and that just makes her incredible in my mind, not to mention that her poetry is fantastic. We then also have another collection of Euripides plays. Euripides is the ancient Greek tragedian that we have the most plays surviving from. So this is a little edition that my dad bought me when he and my mum went to Boston together, and I think he bought in a shop near Harvard University. But it contains within it Alcestis, Hippolytus, Ion, Electra, Iphigenia at Aulis, Iphigenia among the Tyrians, Medea, the Bacchae, the Trojan War, and the Cyclops. And I will say, as you might have noticed there, this, for example, has the Cyclops and it has Alcestis in it, as does this edition. I do have different collections of plays by different authors that contain multiples, and that's not necessarily because I wanted multiple translations of those plays. The reason for that is because I just don't have sets that match up perfectly, so the way I've ended up collecting up my ancient literature means that I have some doubles of plays in different editions, but each of the collections I own contains at least one play that I don't have in another edition, so that way I have a copy of every single play. I'm just going to put these back up here and ignore alphabet at the moment. And that brings us to the bookcase below, which is predominantly Penguin Classics with a few others mixed in. And I will just carry on showing you what we have. We've got one individual play by Sophocles, who's now ancient Greek tragedian, known as Ajax. I have this edition because I studied this in my undergraduate and it was recommended. So it's one of the only tragedies I think I own in a singular edition apart from the Bacchae. We then have my A's. We have some Aristotle. Again, this is Aristotle's Poetics this time. He was the philosopher I mentioned before. Some more plays by the comedian Aristophanes, including Frogs, Wasps, Women and Women at the Thesmophori. And then another edition of Aeschylus's Oresteia, which was the trilogy I mentioned before. In fact, that's right here, including Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, and Eumenides. And I will not lie, this is not the last translation of this trilogy you will see on this bookcase. There's definitely at least one more. I think only one more. We then have some C's and H's. We've got Cassius Dio's The Roman History, The Reign of Augustus. So this is another ancient Roman historian writing on the Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor, not Julius Caesar, who was never actually a Roman emperor, just to clarify. We then have Herodotus's histories. So Herodotus was somebody who wrote down ancient Greek history, particularly the ancient Greeks' ongoing relationship with the Persians, and this is one I studied a lot and continue to use, so there's a lot of tabs in. There are certain books that I just feel like I have never ceased to find uses for, and Herodotus is one of them. No matter what I'm studying, as long as it's about ancient Greece, this seems to end up being useful. We then have Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, or De Rerum Natura, which is a work of Latin philosophy. I love this book. This is one of my favourite pieces of ancient literature. I studied this in university, both in my undergraduate and my master's. It's a work of Epicurean philosophy, and I find myself very drawn in part to Epicurean philosophy. I just think it's very, very interesting. It was originally started by a Greek named Epicurus, and this is a little while later. And I just think it's super, super interesting. I've got a lot of tabs in here to parts I find interesting, but what I will say is that this translation makes me giggle so much, because some way, somehow, and I can't translate Latin, so I make no comment, the translator has managed to put this into rhyming couplets in English, and I don't know how they managed that. So for example, it opens with life-stirring Venus, mother of Aeneas and of Rome, pleasure of men and gods, you make all things beneath the dome, of sliding constellations teem you throng the fruited earth, and the ship-freighted sea for every species comes to birth. Conceived through you and rises forth and gazes on the light, the winds flee from you, goddess, your arrival puts to flight the clouds of heaven. For you the crafty earth contrives sweet flowers, for you the oceans laugh and skies grow peaceful after showers. How? Seriously? Who translated this? How did they do that? I don't understand. It's translated by A.E. Stallings, and honestly, I'm impressed. We then have some more Sophocles. Have I shown you any Sophocles yet? Honestly, I don't think I have. Sophocles is the other ancient Greek tragedy and we have surviving. The three ones that you may know are Euripides, Aeschylus and Sophocles, and this is a collection of his plays including Antigone, Oedipus the King and Oedipus at Colonus. We then have some more Seneca. This is Letters from a Stoic. Stoicism is another branch of philosophy that originated in ancient Greece and then gets carried on by certain Roman philosophers. We then have another collection of Plato's work, the Greek philosopher, and this is The Last Days of Socrates. So Socrates, fun fact, never wrote a single thing down. Socrates, who's up here with his little hat covering his eyes by mistake, is an ancient Greek philosopher who's pretty famous. I think a lot of people recognise his name, but he never wrote anything down. Anything you read that tells you what Socrates says is mainly going to be from Plato, and it's going to be Plato telling you what Socrates supposedly said because Plato was one of his students. So that's just an interesting fact there. And as mentioned before, I have another edition of Ovid's Amores, and this one's titled The Erotic Poems. This is actually the one I used when I studied this in university. Don't know why I've got two translations, to be perfectly honest. Maybe this one was my dad's, I'm not 100% sure. Oh, we then have one last Penguin classic in those more modern editions, which is Virgil's Georgics. Again, maybe I just don't like Virgil because this is kind of boring. It's about farming, but it's actually like a metaphor for Roman life and other aspects, but it reads like it's about farming. It's not for me, but I've kept it because I'm not going to chuck out anything I only have one edition of in case it ever comes up again. We then have some older Penguin classics here. So some of these I would have got second hand or they were originally my dad's. For example, this was originally my dad's. It's the Greek Alexander Romance. Similarly, The Golden Ass by Lucius Apuleius. Ovid's Heroids, which is actually Ovid writing letters from the perspective of women in ancient Greek mythology to the men they were in love with. I think that's quite an interesting one. The same, I think, is true of Xenophon's A History of My Times. This is a piece of history from ancient Greece, and I think that was my dad's. And then this, I believe, is my dad's as well. The Athenian Constitution by Aristotle. This is another one I have multiple editions of, but I feel no guilt in having multiple editions of this because this is exactly my period of history. The 4th century BC, in Athens is my expertise, so I feel like I have the perfect excuse to own multiple editions. And then this one I believe I bought myself second hand. It's another bind up that includes the Satyricon by Petronius, which I showed you before, but also includes the Apokolikintosis, I can never pronounce that, by Seneca, which I'm pretty sure translates as the pumpkinification or the gourdification because it's about someone turning into a pumpkin. Maybe the origins of Cinderella right there, I don't know. We then have two little books from Penguin, including this little edition of Sappho called Come Close. So this is just a few of Sappho's poems collected in one place in these little black 80p editions that Penguin released. So like another really great one to check out if you're just looking to get into classical literature. And this lovely, lovely edition that I got sent by Penguin of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, but he also wrote philosophical works, including this book here, which is the Meditations, and I just think this is beautiful. We then have some even older Penguin classics. Now, if I understand correctly, these are the Penguin classics that predate these editions. So they're just like shorter. They're the same design, but shorter, and going by the price on the back, I think these are older, but I could be wrong. They might just be that they published short ones and tall ones at the same time. But in these we have another edition of Sophocles' Theban plays, which is Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. This was my dad's. I feel no guilt about keeping it. We then have another copy of Virgil's Aeneid, and I know I don't even like this book, so why am I keeping two editions? Because I've written in one of them, so I'm not getting rid of the one I've written in, and I'm not getting rid of my dad's one, so we're just keeping two even though I don't like it. We've got another edition of Ovid's Metamorphosis, and we have Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. So the Peloponnesian War was a war between the Spartans and the Athenians, and Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian who recorded the events of this war. He was also a soldier during it. We then have two smaller Penguin editions which are from their Great Ideas series, I believe that's what it's called. Yes, Great Ideas. We have Great Ideas 1 and Great Ideas 23. This one, I'm not even sure if you can see, maybe that helps. Can you read that there? It is Seneca's On the Shortness of Life, so that's just some of Seneca's work. And then we also have Plato's Symposium, which is just our work by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato on the topic of love. I think this is a really interesting little book. We then have some really old penguins. So I would say these maybe are more like antiquarian books. I certainly wouldn't write in these, but we have another edition of Euripides, which includes Alcestis, Hippolytus, Iphigenia, and Taurus, and Alcestis. I just said that again, sorry. This was actually a gift from my friend Nicola, very lovely, thoughtful gift at that. We then have another edition of Apuleius's The Golden Ass, and this sad little edition of Tacitus on Britain and Germany, which is falling apart, but it was my dad's. And Tacitus was a Roman historian. So, do I know? Oh, I have just had a revelation. No, it's okay. I thought I didn't have an edition of one of my favourite Roman historians. Yes, as somebody who doesn't really care about the Romans, I have a favourite Roman historian, but it's okay, I do, it's fine, we'll get to it. We then got these other really old penguins, which includes another edition of Plato's Symposium. The Campaigns of Alexander as recorded by Arrian. So Alexander was a Macedonian king who sort of created his own empire, and this is a historical work. We then have Caesar on the conquest of Gaul, so yes, Julius Caesar. Another edition of Herodotus' Histories, another copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, and another edition of Sophocles' plays, but in this one we have some different plays. We have Electra, Ajax, Women of Trachis, and Philoctetes. Then, as you've probably been able to see underneath all of those, was this big hardback book, which just doesn't fit in any of the bookcases upright. So I had it lying flat, and this is the translation I recommend you read of the Odyssey. This is the hardback, but it's out in paperback now, and it is the first translation of the Odyssey to be translated by a woman in English to be published in Britain. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant for so many reasons, not least the introduction, which gives you such an interesting look into the history of translating ancient work and the biases within translation. And it's so good. Honestly, it makes some really important changes to traditional translations. And this is the thing about reading translations. It's fantastic. It's an excellent way to access ancient Greek work, and I still use it a lot of the time because it takes a lot longer to read the original language, but you can be misled by your translator on occasion. Okay, so now it's time to tackle these shelves, which are a bit of a mishmash. So if I work my way from this corner here, I will bring out these editions, which belonged to my dad, and he had as long as I knew him, which was obviously from my birth, and they were sort of the books that he first suggested I read when I was getting into ancient history. So these are some of the first editions I read of some of these books. I'm not sure exactly who they are published by. Who are you published by? Tell me, please. They are published by Guild Publishing, London. Not aware of whether they are still around or not, because these came out in the 80s. But in this pile we have Homer's Odyssey, which, like I mentioned, is the first ever edition of the Odyssey I ever read. This is translated by E.V. Rue. It's a prose translation, so one of the things you'll find with ancient literature is that sometimes works that were originally in verse, so poems, are translated into a prose style just for accessibility, and I think that's absolutely grand, and if it's easier for you to start there like I did, go for it. So this is a prose translation and quite a well-known one. We then have Livy, The Early History of Rome. Pretty sure the title of that gives it away. Suetonius, The 12 Caesars, who is that favourite Roman historian that I mentioned earlier. Not because he's the most vital source, although he's a very good source for ancient emperors, the early ancient Roman emperors. He is just kind of hilarious. This is like reading a gossip magazine, and I always enjoy getting to study this at university. We then have Plutarch, The Fall of the Roman Republic. We have Tacitus, The Annals of Imperial Rome. Plutarch, The Age of Alexander. Plato, The Last Days of Socrates. And then Lives of the Later Caesars, which is the first part of the Augustan history. I have like a sneaking suspicion, as somebody who would not consider themselves an expert on ancient Rome, that it's contentious when this was written and how ancient it really is, but whatever, don't really care. Those are those lovely editions of my dad's that I will always keep precious to me. And then similarly, I've got some other older hardback editions of books that my dad collected. My dad was like a massive second-hand book buyer, like he just raided charity and secondhand bookshops to find things. So we have some interesting old editions of certain books, and he never spent much on a book ever. Like, he was not one for collecting expensive antiquarian books. He just took the cheapest edition of any book he could find. So this is the Anabasis and Memorabilia of Xenophon's, so again, ancient Greek historian. And I'm curious when this maybe came out. Okay, so a couple of the pages are actually falling out of this, and I cannot find a publication date, which makes me suspect, from my knowledge of book publications, that it's from the very early 1900s, because there was a time when they didn't put the year of publication in books like they always do now. We then have these little editions of some ancient works. This is the Republic of Plato. This is another piece of ancient philosophy. Oh look, it's so pretty inside. This is an old Everyman's Library edition. Can you see that? Is it focusing? Ignore my face, ignore my face. Oh, I hope that's focusing. I can't really tell from this far away. This is an old Everyman's Library edition. Oh, it just gets even prettier. Look at that. Yes. Look. Oh, yes. That is focused. That is beautiful. So this, let's see if this has a publication date. Who knows? I don't think it does. So I don't think I can tell you again when this one exactly came out. But it's old. So we got that. We've also got some of Socrates' discourses. So again, this is written by Plato as well as Xenophon. So this is actually written by Plato and Xenophon, but is supposedly things that Socrates said. And it's another one that's from the Everyman's Library. But does it have a date in this one? Yes, this one has a date. So this one's from 1933. So that's cool. And then we have another little Everyman's Library one. Is this? Yep, this is another little Everyman's Library one, which came out in 1930, and this is the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, so more ancient Greek philosophy. Then lastly, this tiny little edition of Aeschylus's Suppliants, Maidens, Persians, etc. I love that it says that on the spine. It literally says, like, don't focus on me, focus on the book, focus on the book. It literally says etc. on the spine. This is originally published by Macmillan, and it's got this lovely little plate inside of Hera, the goddess. That's gorgeous. And it came out, if it will tell me, in 1908. That's an old one. Okay. It is nice having these older books, but I would say if you're looking for editions of ancient literature, find a more modern translation, especially if you want something more readable. We then have just like a mishmash of other editions of ancient literature. So this is my copy of the Iliad by Homer. This is the translation I studied at university and would highly, highly recommend. It's by Richmond Lattimore. So if you're looking for a good translation of the Iliad, this is a good one to go with. This is one of the earliest pieces of ancient Greek literature, and it's an epic poem all about the Trojan War. We then have this beast of an edition of Aristotle's Basic Works. This is another one my dad bought me, I believe in America. We then have the last of the 5 ancient Greek novels I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, and this is Heliodorus' Ethiopian Romance, and this again was the only edition I could find of this book, really, that was in English, and it's the last of the 5, like I mentioned. So it's an ancient Greek novel written during the Roman Empire, and it sort of takes the form of a romance story. We then have this little edition of Gorgias's Encomium of Helen. So this is a piece of rhetorical writing, or it's like a teaching exercise / speech. An encomium is basically a piece of praise literature, praising someone. So this is actually a text that explores the various different reasons that might have caused Helen to go to Troy, and why in all of those scenarios Helen was not to blame for the Trojan War. And that's just it here. It also has the ancient Greek inside it. These editions here are particularly used for translation and reading the ancient language with a sort of companion side. They're published by Bristol Classical Press. And again, it's actually the only edition that I could really find of this text, but it's relevant to my studies and it's very, very interesting. So like this. We then have my edition of Plato's Republic that I bought for university. When I mention that I bought it for university, I'm mentioning that because I think that means it is probably a good translation, because it was picked by a lecturer when I was there and they recommended the specific translation. So this one is translated by GMA Grube, and this was the one I was supposed to buy for my course. We then have our last edition of Aeschylus's Odyssey, which is that trilogy of plays I mentioned earlier, and this is the one I bought for university. So this was the one that was recommended by my lecturer. It's translated by Peter Meineck. I have no idea why it has this scene from American politics history on the front. Like, this is so random to me, but it does. We then have the edition of Aristotle's Politics and Constitution of Athens that I bought when I was at university. Another collection of Euripides plays, because like I mentioned, I have to have at least every play, but it does mean some of them double up, and this has Andromache, Hecuba, the Suppliant Women, and Electra inside of it. The only other singular play I have in an edition, and this is the Bacchae, but it is an edition that has the ancient Greek parallel text with the English in there. And then last two books are another one in ancient Greek. This is Lucian's The Ass, an intermediate Greek reader, and this doesn't actually have the English in it at all. This is just an ancient Greek text, but with explanatory like vocabulary and word definitions to help you translate it. And then last but not least, we have this, which is Trials from Classical Athens by Christopher Carey. So this is actually a collection of various different Athenian court speeches in one volume from different orators like Lysias, Demosthenes, Aeschines, Hyperides, etc. that hopefully give you a sort of introductory knowledge of ancient Greek law. So these are good example speeches in terms of teaching us about ancient Greek, well, ancient Athenian law, which again is my sort of area of expertise, but this was my first introduction to the topic because I had to buy this for a course during my undergrad, in which I studied ancient Athenian law and economics, and it really like helped me develop a passion for ancient Athenian rhetoric and legal history, which is what I study now. Like I mentioned, I study rhetoric now in my PhD. I'm researching rhetoric and speeches, which I first encountered some of in this collection. This doesn't have like all the speeches there is, but it's like a great companion to the topic and a really, really interesting book. So I keep that down here as well. But those are all of my classical literature books. Was it more or less than you were expecting? Let me know. Now do feel free to leave any questions in the comments down below about specific books, translations, editions, works for introductions into different topics that you might like me to give you. I'm happy to just sort of like have a little discussion in the comments down below. And also, if you are somebody that is interested in antiquity and likes to read ancient literature, let me know some of your favourites. I would love, love, love to hear about them and why you love them. But yeah, that's my collection. Very, very pleased with it, very happy with it. We'll hopefully continue to grow it ever so slightly as I grow as a scholar. And like I mentioned before, if you are interested in ancient history in general, please do go check out my podcast because I think it works as a pretty good introduction to the topic. I also have a children's book coming out this week or next week, I'm not sure when this video is going up, on the 16th of July, which is all about Greek myths, and it's aimed at 7 to 11-year-olds, and it's published with DK. So if you want an introduction to Greek mythology aimed at children, that is also something that you might like to check out, and all of that will be linked in the description box down below. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again next time. Bye everyone!